Hello there, and welcome once again to the Public Policy Cafe. It's your host, Rector Jibril Mohammed. In our previous lesson, we talked about the concept of bounded rationality and how it manifests in policy making. Today's lesson, we are going to talk about the policy making process. In basic terms, it is how public problems translates into public policies. And to explain this process, I'm going to use the policy cycle. And I want you to understand that the policy cycle is rather a simplistic way of understanding the policy making process. In real terms or in reality, the policy making process is much more complex, but the policy cycle makes it easier for you to understand the various stages that public problems translate into public policies. So without further delay, I'll go right to what we are supposed to study today, which is the policy making process. So the first stage we're going to talk about is agenda setting. Agenda setting is basically the stage where policymakers select various public problems with the aim of finding solutions to them. Now, there are many problems to solve, but due to scarcity of available resources, the government cannot solve everything. And therefore, some problems must be selected at the expense of other problems. And there is much politics that goes on in the selection of problems on the selection of problems to put on government's agenda or policymakers' agenda. But that's a subject for another lesson. An easy way to understand agenda setting is to see it as government making its to-do list. Now, the next stage is the policy formulation stage, and after the problem gets on the agenda of government, a policy needs to be formulated. Therefore, at this stage, policymakers assess the problem and possible solutions based on available information. I say available information because if you remember when we're talking about the concept of bounded rationality, I said that comprehensive information about a problem is not possible. It's not humanly possible. And information about a problem also keeps changing based on what we learn about the problem. Therefore, the policymakers will make a decision based on the available information they have, not comprehensive. And at this stage, policymakers formulate different policy options because there are various solutions to the problem. So they formulate different policy options. So with various policy options in the policy formulation stage, decision makers would have to make a decision on which policy choice they need to take. I must say here that there is also much politics that goes into the decision making. According to the rational choice theory, the decision making is based on weighing the cost and benefits of each policy choice. But in actual terms, when it comes to making decisions, one of the important thing or one of the key criteria is the policy beliefs of political actors or policy actors in the policy subsystem. But that's also a lesson for another. That's also a topic for another lesson. Just know that at this stage, policymakers would have to make a decision on which policy choice to take. Now, after making a decision on which particular policy choice to take, policymakers then implement the, the decision that they've made, the policy choice that they chose. They have to execute it, and this is the stage where we call the implementation stage. So there are a plethora of instruments that policymakers use to execute the decision that they've made to solve a particular problem. And we are going to talk about these um, we're going to talk about these instruments in subsequent lessons. So at this stage, all you have to know is after the policymakers have made a decision on a particular policy choice, they implement it. Now, the next stage, or the final stage in the cycle, is the policy evaluation. So basically, we have a problem. We've made a decision on which policy choice we should do. We've implemented the decision. Now, so what policymakers will do is to evaluate or examine the outcome of the policy, whether did the policy solve the problem or not. What is the result basically of the policy? Now, there are instances where there is an unintended outcome, which is an outcome which policymakers didn't foresee or couldn't predict, and it happened. And this could be positive or negative. Now, policy evaluation is very important in policy learning. Um, it sheds light on the intricacies of the problem and what have you. And also, it is important to know that the policy making process is not as linear as you see here. It could move from implementation stage based on new information available. From implementation stage, we can move back to policy formulation and redraft new policy options. It could move from decision making back to policy formulation. It is not linear always. It can move from one stage to the other. Now, to recap, we talked about the policy making process. And in the process, we talked about the agenda setting, we talked about policy formulation, we talked about decision making, and we talked about policy implementation, and we talked about policy evaluation. Now, in our subsequent lessons, we are going to talk about these stages separately and thoroughly. This is the end of today's lesson. If you've not subscribed, please subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell button to get notification whenever I drop a new lesson. Thank you and enjoy your time. Ciao.